Okay, good evening, everyone. I want to thank you all once again for joining us, to everyone joining us in person, as well as everyone joining us virtually over Zoom. For those who are on Zoom, please note that this time we made sure that there is a copy of the Mari Makomos in the chat. You can find a link in the chat. I want to thank our executive director, Alicia Stein, for all she does on a daily basis, and also for helping us with the Zoom for tonight. And hopefully we're going to get the recording right this time as well. So Be'ez Hashem, everything will be recorded for future reference. Okay. I'm sorry?
It'll be on archives.
It will usually be posted on the website. It will be, if you go to events, the events link on the B'nai Yisrael website, it will be there. Okay, here we go. So we tonight explore the second installment of our three-part series on the fourth of the Aseret HaDibrot. Each year before Zman Matan Torasenu, each year before Shavuos, we do a series on one of the Aseret HaDibrot. This is our fourth year doing it, and accordingly, we're doing the fourth of the Aseret HaDibrot, Zachor Yom Shabbos L'Kadsho, or Shamor Yom Shabbos L'Kadsho. As always, I want to thank our series sponsors, to Jen and David Miller, who sponsor in memory of Rachel Shoretz, Zichron L'Bracha. Our learning should be an aliyah for her neshama, and a zecher for her illustrious memory. And tonight we're going to try to take some of the principles that we outlined last week, and we're going to try to put them into practice. We're going to see some of the many broad applications of the mitzvahs of Shabbos that we outlined and detailed last week. So first, as a brief recap and review, and we're going to jump into the sources once again inside, we saw that there are several mitzvahs pertaining to the institution that we call Shabbos. We tend to think of Shabbos, when we think of the mitzvah associated with Shabbos, the mitzvah we tend to think of most is the mitzvah of lo sa'aseh kol malacha. It's a mitzvah lo sa'aseh, a prohibition against performing constructive and creative labor over the course of Shabbos. And of course, halachically speaking, there are many subcategories of that, and there are many ramifications to it. 39 categories of prohibited labor, the Mishnah and Shabbos that Ayin Gimel tells us, and countless subcategories. There are many applications of that on a day-to-day basis. But we said, in addition to that, there's a mitzvah aseh of Shabbos. There's a mitzvah aseh that declares one should rest on Shabbos. What does that mitzvah aseh entail? So we began to see, and again, we're going to chronicle this once again in just a moment, according to the Ramban and according to the Rambam, that is a general mitzvah to maintain a restful character to the day, even beyond the narrow strictures of malacha. So even if you, in a very creative way, you have a Talmudic mind, so you come up with loopholes for every single one of the 39 malachos, you come up with some constructive labor that enables you to, let's say, engage your ordinary daily parnasa, your ordinary daily work, without, narrowly speaking, violating any of the 39 malachos, comes the mitzvah aseh of Shabbos, positive command telling you to rest, and it says, even though it doesn't, narrowly speaking, violate any one of those 39, you still should desist from that kind of behavior and maintain a restful character to Shabbos. So that's what we saw last week. Just again, to chronicle it in slightly greater detail for a moment. Actually, before I do that, that's what we saw last week. What we want to see tonight is, how does that manifest practically speaking? It's very nice to say that you need to maintain a restful character to Shabbos. It's a beautiful idea. It's inspiring. It's an important idea. But how exactly do we do that? The lo sa'aseh of Shabbos is rather detailed, because there's very clear guidelines about what can be done and what cannot be done. What about application of this broader mitzvah aseh? So here, we're going to return to, in section 1 here, what I call background, we're going to return to some of the sources that we saw last week, but view them through a slightly different lens. And then we will really jump into many of the really practical applications of this principle. Now, before any of that, one shaila that I want to begin with. And this was actually a shaila that I received a lot in my previous post as the rabbi of the Albert Einstein Synagogue when I was serving a congregation of medical students, residents, and the like. And I think it actually serves as a very nice background for the shilas that we're going to discuss tonight. I'll share with you the shaila, and then at the very end, I'll share with you what my answer to the shaila was after we've done all the analysis. But the shaila was as follows. Let's say you have someone who needs to go to a hospital on Shabbos. It could be in theory because they're sick. In my case, it was usually because they were providing medical care. And let's say it's a scenario where they would be licensed to go in on Shabbos. Let's say they were dealing with pikuach nefesh matters. And again, it's a whole major question as to when it's justified and when it's not. But for argument's sake, we will assume that this is a scenario where they should be going into the hospital Shabbos in order to administer life-saving care to patients. Shaila is, I have two ways to get to the hospital. One option is, I can, let's say, call an Uber. Of course, one option is to drive, but that's usually not the best option. Driving yourself, as opposed to having a nachri drive a car or operate a vehicle for you, it will almost always be preferable to do the latter. So unless that's going to be slower and lives are going to be put at risk. I have one scenario where somebody needed to get to the labor and delivery room in the middle of a snowstorm and they weren't sure if the Uber was reliable. Okay, in that scenario, just drive the car to make sure that you get there. But ordinarily speaking, you're going to want a non-Jew to drive you. So the situation is as follows. Either I can, A, call a car service, let's say an Uber. I can get an Uber on Shabbos that will drive me to the hospital. Or alternately, I can use mass transit, either a bus or, let's say, if I'm in New York City, the subway. Rabbi, is it better for me to get to the hospital via Uber, or is it better to get there via subway? It is a very interesting shaila, and a case can be made for either one. We'll go through some of the factors in just a moment. But this became a shaila that I would actually ask to many, many Rosh Yeshiva and poskim because of the fact that there's interesting calculus that can go in either direction. And I can tell you that the answers that I got on the shaila from Rosh Yeshiva, from poskim, from Gedolei Torah, ranged the entire gamut. Sometimes they said one, sometimes they said the other, sometimes they said it depends. I had some poskim who told me it's a choice, it's a wash. Either one is they're roughly equal halachically speaking, so you can do either one. It is a very interesting shaila with factors either way. Now let's just talk through some of the factors together, and we'll conclude with the factors that are most relevant to our conversation tonight. So certain things do really indeed seem to be kind of like a wash. It seems to be parallel either way. Let's start with calling an Uber. In order to call an Uber, let's assume you would need to operate your phone. You need to operate your phone, and that's not something that we ordinarily do on Shabbos. That is a violation of Shabbos. So that requires some Shabbos violation. Let's say, you'll do it with a shinoi, but still it's not something you should ideally be doing. So that's a demerit for the Uber. On the flip side, however, let's say you're going on the subway. If you need to access the subway, you're also going to have to do something in order to access the subway. You're going to have to swipe a card, or as I learned recently, now they don't use the cards anymore. Now you tap with your credit card directly. You don't even need the old Metro cards that we used to use. You just tap with your credit card directly, and you're able to get directly onto the subway. So that too involves some form of, let's say, Isser Shabbos. We'll leave it slightly imprecisely defined, deliberately imprecisely defined for now. But those two would appear to be parallel. You could do each one with a shinoi, but they seem to be roughly similar. So I don't know if either side really has an advantage over the other at this point. Now, it does happen that nowadays, I think you can pre-order an Uber. So if you could pre-order an Uber from before Shabbos, that certainly would help. And that would perhaps be an argument in favor of the Uber. But assuming that you would have to order it closer in time to the actual point when you want to leave towards the hospital, those factors are a wash. Now, there are two potential factors that benefit the subway, and one that I think benefits the Uber. The first factor that potentially benefits the subway is the fact that the subway in New York City runs on electricity. It runs on a third rail, it runs on electricity, as opposed to your average car, opposed to your average automobile, which runs on gasoline. Now, why is that a problem? Gasoline is almost definitely a malacha de'oraisa on Shabbos. One of the 39 malachos is havara, is combustion, is lighting a flame. And that's effectively what happens every time you put on the gas. Every time you step on the gas in a car, what you're doing is you're activating some combustion that causes the car to go. The assumption is that driving a gas-powered car is midoraisa. Whereas most poskim assume that electricity is only aser midrabanan on Shabbos. So in one case, in the case of the Uber, you have a potential iser de'oraisa, whereas in the case of the subway, it would only presumably be, operating the subway is presumably only an iser de'rabanan. That would seem to be a major advantage for the subway. But that's an advantage that can rather easily be neutralized, really in one of two ways. One is a halachic way, and one is a practical way. I'll share with you the halachic way first through a story. The halachic way that it may not be an advantage for the subway is if you assume that electricity is aser midoraisa. And most poskim don't assume that way, but there are some who do. When I first became the rabbi at Bnei Yeshurun, I wasn't even like the rabbi here yet. I was the rabbi-elect, if you will. And over the summer, again, I was going to become the Mara Asra come, let's say, Elul time, and it was really over the summer when I was still living in the Bronx. I wasn't here yet, but we had an opportunity to hear Torah here in Bnei Yeshurun from Rabbi Weiss, who makes an annual visit to Bnei Yeshurun in the summer. And as the new incoming rabbi, I was given an opportunity I see Henry's here in the back. I was in Henry's house. I had the opportunity to meet with Rav Asher and speak to him one-on-one. So I had never spoken with Rav Asher before. What was I going to speak to him about? So I knew that he was the posek for Shaarei Tzedek Hospital, and I was the rabbi at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine who was constantly receiving medical halacha shilas. So I figured, let me discuss with him some of the shilas that actually come up that I've been dealing with. And of course, one of the shilas that I led with is this shilah that I used to ask to every Rosh Hashiva and posek. In the times of Rav Moshe Feinstein, they would say that some people used to write shilos to Rav Moshe Feinstein just in the hope that they'd make it into Igros Moshe. So that when Igros Moshe went on the shelf, their name would be written in the Sefer Igros Moshe. So this was my shilah. This was my shilah that I would go around asking everybody. So I figured I'd ask this shilah to Rav Asher Weiss. So I posed the shilah, and we start talking and learning, and we start talking about the factors. And I said one advantage for the subway is that it is electric, and therefore it is only Asur Midrabanan on Shabbos. Now, that is true for 98% of poskim in the world. But in that 2% happens to be, who holds that as Deoraisa, happens to be Rav Asher Weiss, who holds that electricity is Asur Midoraisa Mishum Makif B'Pata. So as the words are coming out of my mouth, as I'm saying, oh, it's electricity, therefore it's only Midrabanan, it dawns on me that I am speaking to the one Gadol HaPoskim who holds that it is actually Asur Midoraisa. And as I try to get the words back in my mouth, because this is dawning on me for a moment, before I can, he says to me, actually, I don't think electricity is Asur Midrabanan on Shabbos. I think it's Asur Midoraisa. And of course, he starts going through his whole argument, the Diuk and the Rambam, that it's Makif B'Padish, etc. And I really wanted to say, I really know your shita on this, but I didn't really have the opportunity to say that. So it was not my finest moment. But according to Rav Asher, that's not an advantage for the subway because they're both Midoraisa. Of course, it's also possible to make the Uber Midrabanan. And this doesn't require halachic wisdom, it just requires practical know-how. How can you make the Uber Midrabanan? Nowadays, there are lots of electric vehicles. So this is taka, a chumrah, that I tell people when they have to go to the hospital and they have to go by car, there's an option on Uber called Uber Green. And what is Uber Green? They will send you, they'll make sure to send you an electric vehicle. Now, it could be their kavana was to help with Shmir Shabbos. It could be that there was their kavana. It's also possible that it was for environmental consciousness and the like. So I would tell my medical school residents, you can both keep Shabbos and flex your environmental consciousness to your co-residents at the same time by ordering an Uber Green. The way that my former congregants used to hear it, the way they used to quote it is, Rabbi Schrier Paskin, that doctors have to drive a Tesla. That's how they used to quote it, because it's only Asur Midrabanan. But that's a way that it could also be only Midrabanan on the other side as well. So let's say if it's a choice between Uber Green and the subway, if those are the choices, so either way, you're going to have to activate some kind of technology in order to access it, whether it be your phone accessing the app or using a credit card or a subway MTA card to access the subway. That's a wash. Both of them are going to involve Derabanan Malacha. Both of them are going to involve electricity. So if you hold like Rav Asher, that's Midoraisa, Midoraisa. If you hold like the overwhelming majority of poskim, that's Midorabanan, then it is Midorabanan. So far, all is the same. Each one has an argument in its favor. On a narrow halachic level, I shouldn't even really use those words. On a narrow Isur Malacha level, the subway has one major advantage over the Uber. What is the advantage of the subway over the Uber?
It's always going on schedule.
Okay, which is another way of saying what? Which is really,
It's not just for you.
It's not just for you. There's a principle in Amira L'Nachri. When you're not allowed to ask a non-Jew to do something on your behalf on Shabbos that you yourself are not allowed to do. However, if the non-Jew is doing it primarily for other non-Jews, for a broad non-Jewish audience, and in the New York City subway, there will be some Jews as well as non-Jews, but a majority of people, a majority of residents of New York City are still not Jewish. If they're doing it primarily for non-Jews, and I happen to join along, then that significantly mitigates the Isra of Amir L'Nachri. How much? Okay, it could be Machlokas in Chayei Adam and the Magen Avraham, and what the scope of that is and what the scenarios are, but it's definitely a lot better than a Nachri doing something specifically and exclusively for me. When I call that Uber, they are just driving me. They're driving nobody else. It's malacha being done exclusively for me, which would seem to present a major disadvantage to calling the Uber. It would seem to strongly favor taking the subway. But on the flip side, what's the advantage of the Uber over the subway? On an Isser Malacha level, you're not going to come up with much an advantage. What would the advantage be?
Saving a life.
You're saving a life either way. Let's assume again. Obviously, if it's going to slow you down in one way or another and someone's going to die as a result, then you take whichever one's going to get you there faster. Let's assume that each one is going to get you there on time to save lives.
It's not public.
So Kavod Shabbos, public. These are all ways of articulating, I think, the same basic principle that we've been developing. In addition to Isur Malacha b'Shabbos, there is a mitzvah aseh to preserve the character of Shabbos. What you could call it Kavod Shabbos, you could call it mitzvah aseh Shabbos, the publicity. We'll go through again some of the different ways that it's described. We've been describing it as mitzvah aseh Shabbos. You need to maintain a certain character of Shabbos. Now, on an even playing field, I would say that getting in a car itself is a violation of that spirit of Shabbos. Ordinarily, we don't, again, outside of saving lives and going to the hospital and things like that, we don't license you to get inside a car on Shabbos. And we'll chronicle what exactly the source for that is in just a moment. But if you have to have a choice between sitting in the back of a quiet car or getting into the New York City subway system, which is, again, Ein Lacha Bittul Shabbos Gedol Mizu, it's really just, again, it's the hustle and bustle of the busiest city in the world, or one of the busiest cities in the world, on a Shabbos afternoon. There's really, to me, no greater sacrifice of the spirit of Shabbos, no greater violation, affront to the spirit of Shabbos than walking through a busy platform of the New York City subway system. So if you're going to move from narrow Isser Malacha perspective to the broader spirit of Shabbos, then perhaps a strong argument can be made for the Uber over the subway. And as I said to you, the answers from the poskim range the gamut. They should take the subway. They should take the Uber. It depends. How far are they going? What's the scenario? It's a wash. They could choose whichever one they want. I asked this question to Rav Willig and to Rav Avram Steinberg, who's a medical halacha expert, Rav Asher Weiss, who I mentioned before. Again, you get a whole range of answers. What was my answer to the question? Like I said, we'll circle back to that at the end. But let's try to understand some of the practical applications of this mitzvah to say the Shabbos, and accordingly understand some of the principles that went into this shayla that I frequently asked and frequently had to answer as well in the context of those traveling to the hospital on Shabbos. So last week we noted that there are several psukim that point to a prohibition of malacha on Shabbos. Now, if you look at source number one is Shemos Perek Yud Beis. So here we are not actually talking about Shabbos, we are talking about Yom Tov. And if it's Shemos Perek Yud Beis, what Yom Tov are we talking about in particular? We are talking about Pesach. This is the middle of the story of the Exodus. It's Sefer Shemos, the first half of Sefer Shemos, Parshas Bo. And the Torah says, source number one, so the first day is sanctified, the seventh day is sanctified. Those are the 2 days of Yom Tov over the course of Pesach. And then in bold, Kol melacha lo ye'aseh bahem. Don't do any malacha. No prohibited labor on Pesach. The pasuk concludes, that's the famous exception of Ochel Nefesh. The reason why we're allowed to cook on Yom Tov is because of the end of that pasuk. But the bold words say, don't do malacha. That's the mitzvah lo saseh. If you look at the very next pasuk, source number 2, Shemos Perek Yud Beis pasuk Yud Zayin. It is literally one pasuk later. The Torah says, make sure that you properly keep the matzah, because it was on this day that I took you out of Eretz Mitzrayim. And then, in bold once again, Ushmartem es hayom hazeh, and guard this day, here formulated as a mitzvah aseh. Note that there are several potential source texts, there are several potential psukim that can serve as the source for the mitzvah aseh. That will chronicle in a moment. But here we have Ushmartem es hayom hazeh, guard this day. So within these 2 psukim, if we're just looking at the bold of source number 1 and number 2, we have Kol malacha lo ye'aseh bahem, don't do malacha on the one hand, and number 2, guard the day on the other. And the Mechilta in source number 3 asks why we have this dual formulation. Why do I have this formulation, this positive command, guard this day? Didn't the Torah already tell me don't do malacha? So the Gemara answers, the Medrash answers, I would have thought that the only thing prohibited are those 39 categories of creative labor.
I'm doing okay.
Bold. Dvarim shehem mishum shvus minayin.
Can't find it.
How do I know that the Rabbanon matters are prohibited as well? Talmud lomar ushmartem es hayom hazeh lahavi dvarim shehem mishum shvus. Ushmartem es hayom hazeh. That formulation in the positive comes to include things that are prohibited mishum shvus. What is shvus? We discussed last week. Shvus is something that is asur midrabanan, that is rabbinically prohibited. Note the paradox here. The Torah is telling you. So we have a biblical mitzvah to observe rabbinic mitzvos. Ordinarily, that would be a paradox. Either something is rabbinic or it is biblical. But here, the Medrash is telling us the Torah commands us to observe the rabbinic prohibitions of Shabbos as part of the mitzvahs aseh. And we noted, how does the Ramban explain that? The Ramban is quoting, is commenting on another pasuk, the one that appears in source number 4, which we won't read inside in its entirety, but if you look at the bold line, the bold of source number 4, it says, Yiyeh lochem Shabboson, another formulation, this shall be a day of Shabboson, a day of rest. What does that mean? Source number 5, this is the Ramban that we saw last week. V'niralisha medrash hazeh, lomar shenitztabinu min haTorah lios lanu menucha b'yom tov afilu midvarim she'ena malacha. What is this medrash? We didn't see the medrash inside last week. What is this medrash, this mechilta in source number 3? What is this coming to tell me? That I need to maintain a restful character even outside of the strict and narrow commands of the malacha itself. And then again, we're not going to read the entirety of the Ramban again this week, but he goes on to give a whole imagery of what could happen if you didn't have this mitzvah. Again, people would come up with all sorts of loopholes, and they would figure out ways to go to the shuk, and they'd figure out ways to engage in transactions, and people would be measuring their wine and oil and their other wares, their grapes and their dates and things like that, and they would bring them out to the public thoroughfare in order to sell, and the money changers would be sitting at the table, and the banks would be open. He says you have this whole bustling marketplace on Shabbos, where they just employ loopholes in order to avoid malacha. And then the Ramban says at the end, in the second bold passage of source number 5, and everything is going to be mutter. You're going to have a normal market day, and it's going to be mutter because you'll find narrow ways to avoid malacha. Lakach amra Torah Shabboson, sheyeh yom shvisa umenucha lo yom torach. So the Torah says, have a day of Shabboson, have a day of rest. So even though you narrowly averted, strictly speaking, through loopholes, you averted the actual malacha, still make sure you have a day of rest. And what does it mean to have a day of rest according to the medrash so far? It means observe the mitzvos midrabanan. In other words, the Torah gives you 39 categories of malacha. It says, even beyond this, I want to rest. How do we know what it means to rest beyond the 39 malachos? So, what do? Whenever there's ambiguity in Torah, we seek guidance from our Gedolei Torah, from our Chachamim, and they came along and defined for us what it means to have restful character. They gave us all sorts of dinim derabanan. Let's say the most prominent among them is muktzah, dinim and muktzah, which are asur midrabanan on Shabbos. Observe the halachos of muktzah. Through that, you will be able to maintain a restful character of Shabbos. And we saw as well that the Rambam says this in other ways. In source number 6, we have yet another pasuk, Ubayom HaShavi'i Tishbos, rest on the 7th day. And the Rambam in source number 7 said, Ne'emar b'Torah Tishbos afilu midvarim she'enan melacha chayav lishbos mehem, midvarim harbehin she'asur chachamim mishum shvus. This language of Tishbos, rest, in the positive, tells you to observe all the rabbinic commands of Shabbos. So we have this mitzvahs aseh that goes beyond the 39 malachos. Now, 2 things to note here. First, once again, as I alluded to earlier, there are different psukim that potentially serve as the source for this mitzvahs aseh. In source number 2, you have Ushmartem es hayom hazeh. In source number 4, you have Yiyeh lochem Shabboson, the pasuk of the Ramban. And in source number 6, you have Ubayom HaShavi'i Tishbos, the pasuk of the Rama. Each of those can have slightly different implications and can have slightly different ramifications for how we understand them halachically. We're not going to parse all of that out right now. What is interesting for us is the question of the scope of this mitzvahs aseh. The Medrash said it means observe mitzvahs d'Rabbanan of Shabbos. The Ramban said it means observe the mitzvahs d'Rabbanan of Shabbos. The Rambam said it means observe the mitzvahs d'Rabbanan of Shabbos. If you have these 3 sources, you would think that the mitzvahs aseh means observe all of the d'Rabbanans of Shabbos. But you would not necessarily get the impression that it has any halachic ramifications beyond that. If something is prohibited mid'oraisa, don't do it. If it's prohibited mid'rabanan, also don't do it. But what about something that's prohibited neither mid'oraisa nor mid'rabanan? Would the mitzvahs aseh apply to that? And here we get into all sorts of interesting cases that are discussed by contemporary poskim, where potentially it expands beyond the sources that we have seen thus far. So let's talk about what some of those examples might be. And we'll start with the question of travel on Shabbos. Let me ask you a question that also harkens back to our original question that we posed at the very outset. At the very outset, I posed to you a question about having an Uber get you to the hospital on Shabbos or taking the subway to get to the hospital on Shabbos. And we discussed some of the various details and halachic nuances that might apply. Let me ask you this. Forget about the hospital. Let's say a non-Jew is operating a subway or a bus on Shabbos. And I arrange some system whereby I'm able to get on for free. Let's say it's not New York City. Let's say it's a city where there's free public transit, free public transit. What's the prohibition for me to get on that bus or subway or trolley on Shabbos? I'm not doing anything. I'm not doing anything, right? It's free. Again, in our theoretical example, I don't need to pay for anything. I'm not giving them a ticket. I'm just getting on when they stop the train. There's no Amir L'Nachri, because as we said, he's not doing it for me primarily. He's doing it primarily for his non-Jewish clientele in this American city. Is there any cities that we know of where there's free public transit? I don't know. Where? Portland, Oregon. Okay, great. So he's doing it for his primarily non-Jewish clientele in Portland, Oregon. So, yeah, but that's majority Jewish, so that's not going to help you if it's Deerfield Beach. So the driver is not. Okay, fine. But okay, but certainly in Portland, it's majority non-Jewish. So what's the problem? So what's the problem with doing it in public? But maybe it is okay. I'm asking what's the problem, right? Again, like people would realize that it's a problem to drive, but again, what's the problem with utilizing free public transit on Shabbos? Yeah. Okay. So Henry, what Henry is suggesting is he's using the category of uvd in the fall. And again, we're going to use a lot of this terminology loosely, and we'll see how the poskim often use this terminology in overlapping ways. But let's go with uvd in the fall, which is a term that we'll see in the Tzis Eliezer a little bit later. Let's just go with, again, this mitzvah saseh of Shabbos. What you are asserting thereby is that the mitzvah saseh of Shabbos can indeed prohibit things that are not prohibited midoraisa and not prohibited midrabanan. If it violates the character of Shabbos, even though technically speaking on a narrow halachic level, it should be mutter, if it sufficiently violates the spirit of Shabbos day, it will be prohibited. Is that an obvious argument? Not at all. Is it a strong argument? I think it is, as we'll see in just a moment. But just understand that is a major chiddush. Or to put it in other terms, very often you'll hear people saying, somebody will want to engage in an activity on Shabbos. Let's say, in theory, you have a son who's almost bar mitzvah, and he wants to play sports outside on Shabbos. And what is the classic answer? Why can't I play sports on Shabbos? It's no malacha. What will the parents say in that scenario?
It's not Shabbos.
It's not Shabbos. What is that? It's not Shabbos. Is that an argument? Where's the siman in Shulchan Aruch that says that things need to be Shabbos? So what we are effectively articulating when we say something is not Shabbos is it is an affront to the broader spirit of Shabbos and thereby to the mitzvahs aseh of Shabbos. Is there actual halachic basis for such an argument? The answer is yes. The Chazam Sofer in source number 9, but don't skip the source number 9 just yet. Actually, you can skip the source number 9, but we're going to turn back to source number 8 in just a moment. But in source number 9, the Chazam Sofer was asked about Beyor Isser Lahaflik al Ha'agolos Hahochim al Yedei Hakitur. Can you explain to us why it is usher to travel by Agolos Hahochim al Yedei Hakitur? What is that? Kitur. I think it's steam engines. I think is what he's referring to. He says Hema dump wagon. I guess they would call it a dump wagon. I don't know. I don't know about that. Maybe that's what they called it in Pressburg. I don't know. But Agalat Kitur seems to be a kind of steam engine, a steam wagon, right? That's propelled by steam. So why aren't you allowed to do it? Turn back for a moment to source number 8. Shulchan Aruch and Orach Chaim Siman Reish Mem Chesed Aleph says mutter lahaflik b'sfina afilu be'erev Shabbos and holet l'dvar mitzvah. If you're going to do a mitzvah, you can get onto a boat on erev Shabbos, right before Shabbos. You can get onto a boat, and then the Shulchan Aruch quotes you should try to get them to stop and not travel on Shabbos. If they travel on Shabbos anyway, then you're not responsible for it. And then the second line quotes a more famous halacha: if it's not a dvar mitzvah, how many days should you wait before getting onto the boat before Shabbos? It's 3 days, good. If it's not for a mitzvah, get onto the boat 3 days before Shabbos, is what the Shulchan Aruch says. So you're allowed to get onto a boat. Why can't I get onto my dump wagon? Why can't I get onto my my steam engine on Shabbos? So we'll see it's not a steamboat. He's not referring to a steamboat. He's definitely referring to something. He's referring to an agala. He's referring to something that goes on land. And again, my assumption is, you have to speak to a historian, but my assumption is that it's some kind of train, some kind of steam engine. So he considers a number of potential problems. First, he notes that there is a maybe it fits into a similar category of riding an animal on Shabbos, which is Aseret. There's a concern that maybe you'll leave the tchum. Maybe there should be a similar concern here. But he rejects that. Part of the concern of an animal is that maybe you'll rip a branch off and you'll start whipping the animal. That certainly doesn't apply here. You're not going to whip any branches and start whipping your steam engine. That wouldn't be particularly effective. So he says that's not going to be the issue. He says maybe there is an Isser of Amir L'Nachri. He considers that possibility. But he rejects that as well on the same grounds that we did. Why is there no Amir L'Nachri? Because most of the people who are riding on the train are not Jewish. So there isn't going to be Amir L'Nachri. He says maybe you're going to leave the tchum. You're only allowed to travel 2,000 amos on Shabbos. Maybe you're going to leave the tchum. He says that's definitely a real concern. But what if I would make the argument? What if I only want to travel within the tchum? Let's say I want to travel within New York City. Again, the tchum here in New York City is a pretty massive tchum because it's so densely populated and settled. So he says, even still, there would be an Isser. What is the Isser? Go to the bold of source number 9. The whole sock of the Shulchan Aruch and Orach Chaim Reish Mem Ches that we just saw in source number 8 says that it's mutter to travel in a ship is only in a ship. Why? Says if you're on a large ship, let's say you're on a cruise ship, your experience of Shabbos is going to be the same on the ship as it would be on land. You're sitting in the comfort of your own cabin. You're going to have your Shabbos Uda. You're going to sing Zmiros. You're going to share Divrei Torah. The experience is going to be effectively the same as it would be if you were on land. Indeed, that's why some poskim, that's how some of the Rishonim understand the halacha, that you're supposed to get on board 3 days in advance. If it's less than 3 days, then you might get seasick. Once you've already become accustomed to the tossing and turning of the sea after 3 days, you're going to be able to have a full, proper Shabbos on the boat. Aval hanosim b'dump wagon, eino shoves. But if you're traveling on one of these steam trains, it's not like you have a proper Shabbos experience. The gupo navanad, you're being tossed around. It wasn't a particularly smooth ride. The efshelo laso be'iske Shabbos b'shabaso asher ragel lahem beveso. You're not going to be able to properly celebrate the Shabbos the way you would celebrate Shabbos within your own home. And you're also going to a particular destination so that you could do business on a weekday. That's the scenario he's dealing with. And even though I can't point to any particular reason, he says, why there should be malacha, it is still prohibited mida oraisa. And what source does he marshal for that argument? Afilu mida oraisa leharamban hanal. The Ramban that says that there's an Isser Asay of Shabbos, to maintain the character of Shabbos, would prohibit you to get on a train, even if you can avoid every narrow Isser and every narrow Malacha. He ultimately quotes a pasuk in Yeshaya in source number 10 that supports the idea as well. And he says that is why you cannot get on a train on Shabbos. To update the example, we could have called this train, the Schrier, planes, trains, and automobiles. The Tzitz Eliezer, in source number 11, makes the same argument when it comes to an airplane. If you look at source number 11, Biur halacha b'din haflaga b'sfina b'Shabbos, hamistoif mizeladin haflaga ba'aviron b'hayetzia. He says there would be, again, and if you look at his analysis, he gives several reasons why a plane would be problematic. It would be problematic because of tchumen, even though it's the Malo Me'asar Tvachim. He gives a whole complicated analysis, but much of it rests, if you look at all these middle paragraphs, rests on the same analysis as the Chasam Sofer that says that it would be an affront to the mitzvahs aseh of Shabbos. He says, if you look at the end, he says, okay, so it's going to be usher to get on a train. It's going to be usher to get on an airplane. Most poskim assume that, again, absent pikuach nefesh, need or consideration, it would be usher to get into a car as well. And he adds another fascinating example. If you look at the bottom paragraph, he says, "V'chein meha amor medubar adko nira pasha she'asur lensoa b'Shabbos o Yom Tov be'ofanayim." What is ofanayim? A bicycle, not to be confused with the word mishkafayim. I had a friend in Eretz Yisrael when we were there for the year. The Israeli mashkiach got a new pair of glasses, and he complimented him on his new ofanayim, and he got quite a look from the Israeli mashkiach. So ofanayim is a bicycle. Can you ride a bike on Shabbos? What's wrong with riding a bike on Shabbos? There are some Svaradi poskim who allow it. They say, there's no Isser here. What's the problem with riding a bike on Shabbos? The Ashkenazi poskim consider a whole host of different problems. So if you look at, again, if you just look at the Tzitz Eliezer here, we're not going to read all of it inside. Maybe it's a Gzeira that you're going to leave the Tchum. Like we said before, there's a concern you're going to leave the Tchum. But Chazal didn't make a Gzeira on bicycles that you're going to leave the Tchum. I assure you that. Chazal weren't riding bicycles, so they didn't make any Gzeira on it. Are we allowed to make up new Gzeiras that maybe you're going to leave the Tchum? Let's say you're again in Teaneck, New Jersey, where the Tchum extends pretty far, right? Because of all the neighboring towns and the dense urban development. It's not so pashut to say that there's a Gzeira you're going to leave the Tchum. Some suggest, again, this Eliezer says as well, it's a Gzeira Shemi Yatakin Manet. Maybe your bike chain is going to fall off the gear and you're going to fix it, so you can't use it because of Gzeira, maybe you're going to fix it on Shabbos. That argument can be made about anything on Shabbos. Maybe anything you use is going to break on Shabbos. Maybe you should be able to use a sitter because maybe a page will tear out and you're going to tape it back in. Many poskim say, no, they turn to Rav Waldenberg and they say, we don't make new Gzeros nowadays. You can't just decide that there's a Gzeira Shemi Yatakin Man. So what is the argument that many of the poskim settle on? If you look at that final bold line of source number 11, Mishum Uvdin Dechol, the Yesh Bazeh Asei Shel Torah Kanal, B'Shem Haramban, B'Chasam Sofer. It's not deemed to be a proper and Shabbostic activity. Shabbos is a day of rest. It's a day of immobility. We're not supposed to be engaged in the frenetic movement from place to place that we're engaged in over the course of six days of the week. And the whole point of Shabbos, the reason why there is an Isser Tchum, is to stay in one place, to rest, to stay sedentary for one day. So getting on a bicycle and going from place to place, that's considered an affront to the nature of Shabbos. And that is why the standard psak among Ashkenazim is indeed to prohibit bike riding on Shabbos. Again, what's the category? What's the Isser? The answer is, it doesn't fit into Shabbostic activity, and it is therefore not within the mitzvahs aseh of Shabbos. Now,
Rabbi,
yes.
What about the Marasigning? You know, you have a world around you. It's not only what you're allowed to do, but there's a whole community of people.
Ruby, are you asking about bike riding?
No, in general, if you're in an emergency, no one knows that you're going to an emergency.
Okay.
And you have a choice of the train or the
So
Uber.
right. So good. So that's a good question. The question was what about Marazan? So if we're talking about the bicycle shaila, if it's not, I know again, I'll get to your shaila narrowly in just a moment. If we're talking about the bicycle shaila, then if it's not usher, then it's not usher. There's no Marasayan, right? Because you're not doing anything prohibited. So there's no public perception of anything wrong if you're not doing anything prohibited. What about the doctor who gets into a car or an Uber, or a subway? So there, I would always tell these physicians that they should wear their scrubs or their lab coats or whatever the case may be when they are getting into the car or into the subway. So that it should be evidence. It should be clear that that they're doing it for medical reasons, for pikuach nefesh, rather than just a joyride over the course of Shabbos.
On the bicycle,
Mhm.
they allow children. Are children allowed, like in Israel, to ride bikes?
Why are children allowed in Israel to ride bikes? So first of all, again, it's not necessarily pashut that they are. Rav Schechter does have a distinction between a bicycle and a tricycle. Rav Schechter says a tricycle is inherently a child's toy. There's no concern of tchumen. It's not designed to leave the tchum. It's not even going to be an affront to the mitzvahs aseh of Shabbos because it's not really designed for motion. It's not really designed to get you from place to place. It's designed as a children's toy. Now, nowadays, you'll see these like motorbikes that are actually motor trikes. I don't care how cool you think you are. If you're on a tricycle, you're on a tricycle. That's my opinion. But Rav Schechter holds that lahalacha. Rav Schechter holds that a tricycle is a different din, and therefore it doesn't have the same status of any of these halachic considerations because it's designed as a children's toy. So that's the reason why you perhaps have more latitude for children. Yeah. So scooters pose an interesting shaila. There are adult motor-like scooters, which I think would of course be a problem. And again, certainly the motor would obviously be a problem. For young kids, I think an argument can be made that would be okay, akin to Rav Schechter's argument with the tricycle. Now, where are you going to draw the line? I think there's a difference between a 3-year-old on a scooter and a 12-year-old on a scooter. So again, that's a little bit more difficult. You have to feel out each child and where they're at. I think for very young children, an argument can likely be made akin to Rav Schechter's argument by tricycles that it's a children's toy and doesn't fall into a similar category as bikes. Okay. Just quickly, let's try to finish up. We won't read sources 12 through 14 inside, but there are other applications beyond motion that come up. Another classic example of the shaila was Shabbos clocks when they first came out. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to prohibit everyone's Shabbos clocks, but I will tell you in full transparency that Moshe Feinstein, when Shabbos clocks came out, felt that they should be usher. Now, he doesn't speak exactly in the same categories that we did. Like I said, we're using terms a little bit loosely. Uvdin the whole Aseret Shabbos. The category that Moshe uses is Kavod Shabbos or Bizoy Shabbos. Alternately, he says that it's just going to be an affront to Shabbos if you have things turning on and off over the course of Shabbos. But if you look at just one line, let's just take the bold of source number 12. It says the Shaila is Malacha Hanas Shabbos Al Yedei Sha'on Shabbos, literally Al Yedei a Shabbos clock. Like many Chuvas and Ikras Moshe, this was addressed to Rav Tendler. This was addressed to Rav Mordechai Tendler. And then he answers in bold in source number 12, the second paragraph. He says, Hine Lefiani Asdaiti Pashut She'asur Lahatir Zeh Tahare Al Yedei Mora Sha'os Kazeh Yecholim La'asos Kol HaMelachos B'Shabbos. We have factories in parentheses. That is just a modern articulation of the Ramban. It says Ramosha, you're going to start with just the lights in your dining room, or maybe your air conditioning in your bedroom. And what's going to happen? Then they're going to have all the factories operating on Shabbos clocks over the course of Shabbos, and Shabbos will be destroyed. There will be no more spirit of Shabbos. Now, again, he doesn't quite articulate it in the exact same terminology as the Ramban, but the basic argument is the same. Ramosha felt that Shabbos clocks should be prohibited. That has not become standard protocol. Most of us have accepted Shabbos clocks. I believe that Rosh Hashanah Shlita will only use a Shabbos clock in cases of hefsed, cases of significant hefsed. For lights, he'll leave his lights on Shabbos. In the case of like the air conditioning in Washington Heights during the summer, where again, just if you leave the air conditioning on for 25 hours, it will really run up your electricity bill very high. There, I've heard he's willing to use a Shabbos clock. Most of us simply use Shabbos clocks. Again, for whatever reason, this psak of Rav Moshe wasn't accepted, and we felt that it does not constitute an affront to the spirit of Shabbos. A similar question came up with these Shabbos lamps. How many people own a Shabbos lamp? I own a Shabbos lamp. For those who are unfamiliar, a Shabbos lamp is a lamp that you turn on, and there's this kind of cylinder, this cylindrical cover to the lamp, which is opaque on one side, is transparent on the other. So it's simply by turning it, you're not impacting the circuitry, you're not impacting the electricity at all, but you can either darken it or lighten it depending on how you turn it at the top. Again, I didn't speak to him about this directly, but I've heard B'Shem of Sobolovsky, Shlita, that he doesn't like that. He feels that is an affront to the mitzvah aseh of Shabbos. You've effectively created a light where, okay, you're not flipping a switch on and off, you're turning it one side or the other, but it's tantamount to the same thing, and therefore it shouldn't be within Aseh Shabbos. Now again, I don't think that's really become accepted either. As I said before, I have a Shabbos lamp in my own home. I use it. I think many people do. But you just see where these factors come into play. One case where I have not seen any reputable posek that allowed it is what they called the kosher switch. The kosher switch. I put kosher in quotation marks. What was the kosher switch? They worked out some chap with the circuitry so that when you press the switch, you're literally flipping a light switch on and off. They invoked a grumma, whatever arguments they wanted to make. We don't need to get into the nuances right now, in terms of the electrical engineering or in terms of the halacha. But they wanted to make this argument that it's mutter to turn lights on and off on Shabbos. Now, again, many were skeptical about the narrow halachic arguments they were making. Was it really a grumma or is it not? But even if you'd come up with a contraption that narrowly overts every single isser, I don't think you'll find a single posek that will ever sign on to a kosher switch that enables you to turn lights on and off and operate electricity fully over the course of Shabbos. Why? Because again, you have the same factor of spirit of Shabbos. Even if you've managed to create some kind of loophole within the circuitry, you've turned Shabbos into a day of chol. Yeah.
I have a real case. I was in Israel and Shabbos lunch, and I was choking on a fish bone in the Plaza Hotel.
Okay.
They were of little help. Anyway, somebody,
Yeah.
I don't know who, called a cab to take me to the hospital.
Right.
So we went to the hospital. That also was a whole story, but I'll skip that.
Yeah.
Some doctor took a pliers and put it down my throat,
Wow.
knocked it out. We were good.
Okay. Baruch Hashem.
The taxi driver,
Yeah.
when he let us off, said, I will wait for you and take you back to the hotel. I'm not sure what I answered. I think I said yes. And we got out of the hospital. There he was.
Right.
Was I permitted, which I did, get in the cab. and
Okay.
go.
So Bobby, you're asking, I don't want to get too much into this right now. It is an important question. It's an important question and it's a rich question also. The question was, if I went to the hospital on Shabbos, am I allowed to then do malacha to get home on Shabbos? So under many circumstances, this would be permissible.
But I wanted to go home and rest.
Right, okay, so it was L'Torah Shabbos. Okay, so it largely depends on the particulars of the scenario. We do have a principle, again, its scope is a little bit challenging, it's beyond the scope of our discussion for tonight. But we sometimes have a principle of hitiru sofo atu tchilasa. Certainly for the person who is driving you, it's okay to come back on the basis of Chazal were concerned that if you weren't allowed to come back, then you hesitate to go in the first place. So that's for example, the basis of why Jewish EMTs are allowed to come back to their homes after driving a patient to the hospital for that reason, right? So the exact scope of that is a little bit beyond our discussion for now, but yes, that is a principle rooted in Halacha. So, given all of the above, how do you answer the shaila? Is it better to take the subway, or is it better to take the Uber? So again, the poskim range on this issue, but I'll tell you what my answer usually was. From my standpoint, it would largely depend. It would largely depend, and it would depend on factors very much related to the essence of the Ramban's description of mitzvahs aseh of Shabbos. What I mean by that is as follows. I would ask a healthcare provider, again, someone who we're presuming had a legitimate reason to travel to the hospital on Shabbos. What are we talking about? Are we talking about one Shabbos a year? Are we talking about every single Shabbos for an entire winter? What exactly is the scenario that we're looking at? What kind of Shabbos home would you be returning to? Is this someone, again, I had in my previous community, it was medical students, 1/3 of my community was single, 1/3 was married without children, 1/3 was married with children, which is kind of what you'd expect at that kind of stage of life. What kind of Shabbos home are you returning to? When you return home, are you going to be singing Shabbos miros at a full Shabbos table? Are you going to be returning to an apartment that doesn't have any candles or doesn't have a Shabbos table? And to me, those factors would have a very significant impact on what narrow answer I would give to this shaila. People would sometimes ask me, again, people who are going into the hospital for very long residence hours, they'd say, Rabbi, is it better to daven b'yechidus in a better zman, in a better time, or better to daven in a minyan, but without the ideal zman, without the ideal timing? What's a priority, tefillah b'tzibur or tefillah b'zman? I would often say, it depends. Are we talking about a conflict for a week? Are we talking about a conflict for a month? Are we talking about a conflict that's going to exist for perpetuity? If you're talking about a week, personally, I would prefer the zman over the tefillah b'tzibur. That's a rich discussion in poskim that you can construct an answer either way. If you're asking me, my Rabbi and my Masorah, if you're talking about just a week, better to daven b'zman in your own home than daven b'tzibur in a non-ideal zman. For 1 week, that's the answer I would give you. If you're talking about months at a time, spiritual damage of not having a community, of people that you're davening with, of having just the positive atmosphere of shul, of the lively and vibrant experience of communal religious life, if it just means that you're going to be davening in a dark corner of your house every single day, then that to me is a grave spiritual danger. That's a spiritual pikuach nefesh. And people who are doing that constantly, they end up not doing that at all. If you end up just davening b'yechidus in order to maintain the proper zman over the course of an extended period of time, there is a grave danger that you will not daven in the proper zman, and at a certain point that you don't end up davening at all whatsoever. You need a framework of communal spiritual life in order to maintain your personal religious attainments and to maintain a path of personal spiritual and religious growth. When it comes to Shabbos as well, I would say the same thing. If it was just one Shabbos, I think probably better to take the subway than to take the Uber. Because again, you have that strong argument that it's being done for the public. It's not being done for you narrowly. On a strict, narrow Eastern Malacha level, the subway was definitely superior to the Uber. But it was something that you were going to be doing every single week. And you really would risk losing the very experience of Shabbos itself, the character of Shabbos itself. You're going to be spending every single Shabbos walking through the platforms in Times Square in order to catch your subway train, in order to travel with others. You've lost the very essence of the experience of Shabbos. And that, no matter what the arguments are on the other side, that's not something that we can be ready to compromise. In that scenario, I'd say better to get in the car with the additional potential isur that it involves in order to maintain the mitzvahs aseh, the positive command of the Shabbos experience itself. And as much as that's formulated in the negative of not avoiding losing Shabbos, what we're going to turn to Be'ez Hashem next week is ways to facilitate the positive. So we've said that there is this mitzvahs aseh of Shabbos. We've detailed that it prohibits additional activity beyond the narrow malachos. But what about investing in the positive? How do we facilitate that Shabbos atmosphere within our homes? How do we make our children feel that positive Shabbos? How do we make our Shabbos meaningful? As Hashem, we will explore that next week. Thank you again for everyone for coming. I wish you all a wonderful night. Bye, everyone.